For centuries, archaeologists and pseudo-archaeologists have spent time and resources trying to find the lost city of Atlantis. A city that, according to Plato, sank into the Atlantic Ocean in just one day. It's been over 2,000 years since Atlantis vanished, and the location of this great city has remained lost to us. Until now. Expeditions have been launched far and wide to find this city, but it would appear Atlantis has been staring us right in the face all the while. From Greece to Africa, we took a trip around the world to solve one of mankind's biggest puzzles, the location of the lost city of Atlantis. And what we discovered might just change everything we've ever known about mankind and civilization since the very dawn of time. On March 13, 2011, National Geographic ran a 1-hour-long documentary which reported the efforts of a Hartford University archaeologist to find the lost city of Atlantis.
A city of dreams. Incredible architecture. A massive navy. Atlantis is thought to be one of the most advanced societies of the ancient world. Then, without warning, it literally vanishes overnight.
Richard Freund's journey to Atlantis began with this satellite photo. Featured in this image is a salt marsh at the tip of Spain's Guadalquivir River, northwest of Cadiz. And Freund and many other scientists believed that this site was the location of the mighty civilization that Plato talked about. A highly advanced city that mysteriously disappeared into the depths of the sea nearly 3,000 years ago. As the documentary unfolds, the world watches as Freund makes multiple intriguing finds, including one 2,800-year-old image of an Atlantean warrior guarding the entrance to a lost, multi-ringed city.
This standing stone in front of a warrior with his sword drawn, and here we have the concentric circles of the city that he's guarding. This signpost points to a city with one entrance in, and coming out. And in the center, the same thing that Plato is describing in Atlantis, central shrine of Poseidon. It's their memory of the past. And the symbols that we find on this is the way they remember Atlantis.
Did Richard Freund just find the lost city of Atlantis? Before we continue on our journey of the discovery of Atlantis, it might be best to start with the legend of Atlantis. To date, there have been dozens of claims that Atlantis has been discovered by one researcher or the other. However, for a discovery to be considered valid, then all physical descriptions of said thing must be present in the order in which they were described. The chronology must also align with the given timeline, otherwise we have to rule it as mere speculation. So with that said, let's unpack this mystery, beginning with the legend of Atlantis. Long, long ago, the Hellenic deities of old divided the world amongst themselves. In that allotment, Zeus got heaven, Hades got the underworld, and Poseidon was granted the seas, a deal that made him very happy indeed. On one of these seas was the island of Atlantis, and according to legend, the island was so enormous it was larger than ancient Libya and Asia Minor combined. On the northern side of Atlantis and along its shores were huge mountains, and on its southern side was the royal state, which boasted a vast plain shaped like an oblong and measured 3,000 by 2,000 stadia, or 340 by 230 miles. According to Plato's story, Poseidon fell in love with a human named Cleito, and she had 5 pairs of male twins for him. The eldest of the kids was Atlas, who, by virtue of being Poseidon's heir, became the ruler of the entire island and the surrounding ocean. The surrounding ocean, as you might have guessed, was the Atlantic Ocean, which was named the Atlantic after him. Poseidon also gave Atlas the mountain in which he was born, along with all of the surrounding areas as his inheritance. Atlas's brothers, on the other hand, got other territories as gifts from their father. For his beloved wife, Cleito, Poseidon carved a magnificent palace into the mountain where she lived. He then surrounded this mountain with 3 concentric circles of moats, each one wider than the next, and separated by rings of land proportional in size. The Atlantean civilization, already blessed with such an amazing territory, would turn out to be a highly sophisticated and technologically advanced people. For instance, they built bridges from the mountains to the island and dug canals that connected to the ocean. They also carved out tunnels into rocks to create a passage for ships into the city and built docks for these ships from the rock walls of the moats. Plus, Atlantis was a well-guarded city. Every passage into Atlantis was protected by intimidating gates and towers. And for each of the concentric rings that surrounded the city, there was a wall constructed from red, white, and black rock. These rocks were quarried from the moats and covered in tin, brass, and orichalcum, which happens to be a precious metal. Now you're probably thinking at this point that the Atlanteans must have been a very proud people, and that's understandable, but it may surprise you to know that the Atlanteans were actually the poster child for an ideal commonwealth, at least at first. You see, Atlantis was a very wealthy nation, mostly thanks to its lucrative maritime traffic. And this wealth gave them unimaginable power. Unfortunately, this was where things started to go wrong for Atlantis. Because with great power came great hubris, and suddenly, Atlantis began to court the idea of world domination. First, the Atlanteans conquered parts of Libya, and then Egypt. And then, when that wasn't enough, the city stretched its hands as far as the European continent, enslaving all of its subjects with plans to conquer even more regions. At this point, Atlantis' neighbors, the Athenians, had it, so they decided to call together an alliance of rebels to go against Atlantis. Unfortunately, the alliance didn't stand, as many nations feared the Atlanteans. The Athenians were thus left alone to go against them. And much to everyone's shock, the Athenians won, defeating Atlantis and liberating all the occupied lands in the process. Unfortunately for Atlantis, their shameful defeat was only just the beginning of their woes. Because right after the war, violent earthquakes and floods would follow, and the island of Atlantis and all its men would disappear into the depths of the sea, never to be seen again. Now, for centuries since Plato told this tale, many have argued about whether the story is truth or fiction. And to be fair, both sides have made really excellent points worth considering. However, something happened in the late 19th century that seems to suggest that Plato's story was very likely not a fabrication. Around the 1870s, there was a German businessman called Heinrich Schliemann. Schliemann grew up obsessed with Homer's epics, and obsessed with himself, I guess. I heard a lot of his reputation was actually built from his self-mythologizing. Anyway, it's not the point of this video. The point is, he was convinced that Homer's Iliad and Odyssey related real historical events. And you've got to realize the importance of this, because at the time, most people took for granted that both poems were works of fiction. I mean, that's like someone believing a Superman exists just by reading the comics. But Schliemann, who would go on to become one of the fathers of modern archaeology, I wonder who gave him that title, begged to disagree. And here's where things got crazy. In 1872, his assumptions were finally proven right when he discovered the ancient city of Troy. In fact, the city predated Homer's Troy by a couple of centuries. With this, that means Schliemann's discovery confirms for us that there was indeed a highly advanced civilization that existed before the classical Greek period, which gradually became lost through history. This means that the part about the Greek civilization in Plato's story could also be possible. Now, if at least one part of Plato's tale has been verified as true, what's to say the rest aren't? And if we were to follow Plato's ideas, that means Atlantis had been here all along. If there was one man who believed in the existence of a real Atlantis, it was Ignatius Donnelly. Donnelly was a populist politician and US congressman in his day. He was also an amateur historian. And in 1882, he wrote a book where he attempted to prove the existence of Atlantis using these 13 hypotheses. 1. that there once existed in the Atlantic Ocean, opposite the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea, a large island which was the remnant of an Atlantic continent and known to the ancient world as Atlantis. 2. That the description of this island given by Plato is not, as has been long supposed, fable, but veritable history. 3. That Atlantis was the region where man first rose from a state of barbarism to civilization. 4. That it became, in the course of ages, a populous and mighty nation, from whose overflowings the shores of the Gulf of Mexico, the Mississippi River, the Amazon, the Pacific coast of South America, the Mediterranean, the west coast of Europe and Africa, the Baltic, the Black Sea, and the Caspian were populated by civilized nations. 5. That it was the true antediluvian world, the Garden of Eden, the Gardens of Hesperides, the Elysian Fields, the Garden of Alcinous, the Mesamphilos, the Olympus, the Asgard of the traditions of the ancient nations, representing a universal memory of a great land, where early mankind dwelt for ages in peace and happiness. 6. That the gods and goddesses of the ancient Greeks, the Phoenicians, the Hindus, and the Scandinavians were simply the kings, queens, and heroes of Atlantis, and the acts attributed to them in mythology are a confused recollection of real historical events. 7. That the mythology of Egypt and Peru represented the original religion of Atlantis, which was sun worship. 8. That the oldest colony formed by the Atlanteans was probably in Egypt, whose civilization was a reproduction of that of the Atlantic island. 9. That the implements of the Bronze Age of Europe were derived from Atlantis. The Atlanteans were also the first manufacturers of iron. 10. That the Phoenician alphabet, parent of all the European alphabets, was derived from an Atlantis alphabet, which was also conveyed from Atlantis to the Mayas of Central America. 11. That Atlantis was the original seat of the Aryan or Indo-European family of nations, as well as of the Semitic people and possibly also of the Turanian races. 12. That Atlantis perished in a terrible convulsion of nature, in which the whole island sunk into the ocean with nearly all of its inhabitants. And 13. That a few people escaped in ships and on rafts and carried to the nations east and west the tidings of the appalling catastrophe, which has survived to our own time in the flood and deluge legends of the different nations of the Old and New worlds. As you can see from his hypotheses, Donnelly believed that the lost city of Atlantis was located in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. He also believed that the catastrophe that submerged Atlantis was actually the Great Flood, a myth that is represented in every culture of the world. Well, myth might be a strong word, since we have actual geological proof that a global flood indeed happened. But even more interesting and more to the point of our video, this flood is said to have happened around 9500 BC, which is pretty close to the time that Plato said Atlantis got destroyed. As Donnelly points out, nearly every culture in the world has a flood myth, from the Jewish people, to the Aryans, to the Phoenicians, to the Greeks, to the Americans. Others, without an established flood myth, at least hint at it. That is, except for Egypt. Egypt is the only civilization without a single allusion to the Great Flood. Donnelly's explanation for this is that Egypt knew the precise history of the destruction of Atlantis, the historical event from which all flood narratives grew. So, rather than preserve the myth of a Great Flood, Egypt instead preserved the actual historical destruction of Atlantis instead. But wait, it gets better. Ever heard of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge? It's a huge chain of underwater mountains that looks a lot like a continental mass. Now, get this. This ridge was discovered by the Challenger and Dolphin expeditions right around the time Donnelly wrote his book. And according to reports from the Challenger expedition, the entire ridge, when discovered, was covered in volcanic deposits. As a matter of fact, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is actually a volcanic mountain range, which is very interesting since Plato did mention that Atlantis got submerged after a series of catastrophic volcanoes and earthquakes. Donnelly's argument, therefore, is that if the mountains of Atlantis contained volcanoes, then when the convulsion happened, it was probably accompanied by huge discharges of water which eventually drowned Atlantis. and apparently it wouldn't be the first time this happened. In his book, Donnelly cites an example of a similar catastrophe happening on an island in Java, where 4,000 people perished after huge columns of hot water and boiling mud spewed out of the Galunggung volcano. And that's not even all. Donnelly also points out that those who claim that Plato's tale of Atlantis was mere fiction still have to grapple with the fact that Plato was remarkably accurate in his description of the geography of the Atlantic. For instance, Plato stated in his story that there was a passage west from Atlantis to the rest of the islands, as well as from these islands to the whole opposite continent that surrounds that real sea. If he was making the story up, then how did he also invent the islands and the continent which we now know to be the West Indies and America respectively? Secondly, Plato also accurately described the Mediterranean as being a landlocked body of water in comparison to the Atlantic Ocean, which he referred to as a real sea. How could he have known this if the story wasn't, in fact, true? Sure, you could say that he probably learned this from travel, but Donnelly argues that to establish that fact, Plato would have had to make a long voyage, and that the Greeks during this time mostly kept close to their shores and only made short voyages. So, could Atlantis actually still be buried underneath the Atlantic Ocean? Well, this next theory disagrees with Donnelly's position, for the primary reason that fighting wars over such vast distances would have been logistically impossible for the Atlanteans. Their contender for the location of the lost city of Atlantis, therefore, is Crete, where Europe's first great civilization, the Minoans, lived. And there have been many convincing pieces of evidence that lend this theory some credibility. First, the Minoan civilization was the most powerful trading empire of the Bronze Age. And just like the powerful Atlanteans in Plato's tale, the Minoans did control one main island, several other islands, and parts of the exact same continents that Plato claimed were enslaved by the Atlanteans. And that's not all. There are even more shockingly specific details where the Minoan civilization matches the Atlantean legend perfectly, especially when it comes to the Temple of Poseidon described by Plato in his story and the Minoans' palace of Knossos. But let's begin with other, smaller details, like how the Minoans had super advanced hydraulic systems that supplied both hot and cold water, just like the Atlanteans. On top of that, the Minoan Empire also had buildings made from red, white, and black stones, just like the Atlanteans in Plato's story. And to hit the nail of the coffin, there are records that the Minoans fought the Mycenaean Greeks and lost, just like Plato narrated in his legend. The only part of the Atlantean legend that does not fit in the Crete theory is the circular metropolis of Atlantis. But holders of this theory believe that it is simply because Plato got Santorini and Crete conflated. Santorini was where the circular rings of lands and sea occurred, and Plato somehow wove that into a story he was telling about the Minoan civilization, which resided on the island of Crete. Now, let's talk about the temple, where the similarities become even more striking. To begin with, we need to know what Plato said about the temples of Poseidon in Atlantis. According to Plato, the temple was dedicated both to Poseidon and to his lover, Cleito. Plato also said that the temple was constructed in the center of the island, probably near a very vast plain. Another thing Plato points out, which is crucial, is that the temple looked somewhat barbaric, with many statues in and around it. The Temple of Poseidon also had bulls roaming around inside, which were hunted by the kings of Atlantis and sacrificed on a sacred pillar to Poseidon. Now, let's see how this story tracks with the Palace of Knossos on the island of Crete. Well, first off, even though it's called a palace, scholars all agreed on the fact that the complex served religious functions, although it's unclear if this was the main purpose of the place. Whatever the case, this palace temple was dedicated to Poseidon, or Potidon as the Minoans called him. And strikingly, the Minoan Potidon was also associated with the bull, as is evidenced in the bull symbols that decorate the walls of the Palace of Knossos. Not only that, there's pretty good evidence that the kings of Minos sacrificed a bull to Poseidon every year, just like the Atlantean kings did in Plato's tale. There's also good evidence that the Palace of Knossos wasn't only dedicated to Poseidon, It was also dedicated to a goddess known simply as the Lady, and according to Minoan myth, this goddess was the lover of Poseidon. That's not all. When we check the geography of the Palace of Knossos, we find that it lies in the center of Crete, next to the sprawling Sahara plain. And once again, this tracks perfectly with the Temple of Poseidon in Plato's story, said to be located in the center of the island and next to a vast plain. Now, all of these discoveries are obviously great. However, there's still one problem with the Crete theory. One major flaw in the Minoan theory is that the Minoan civilization disappeared from history not 12,000 years ago like the city of Atlantis in Plato's story, but around 2,500 years ago. According to geologists, the Minoans were probably wiped out by the Thera volcanic eruption, followed by a tsunami caused by the powerful waves from the volcano. Once again, this sounds very similar to Plato's story of Atlantis getting hit by a volcano and getting submerged underwater. The location and timing, however, are glaringly off. In fact, we simply have no traces of any advanced civilization going as far back as 12,000 years ago. But Gallinopoulos, a Greek seismologist with a special interest in the Atlantean legend, has pointed out that it's always weird whenever Plato mentions numbers that are multiples of 1,000, almost like the numbers are always off by a factor of 10. So, Gallinopoulos suggests that copyists probably mistook 100 in Plato's writing for 1,000 while recopying Plato's text, which is why we have such exaggerated figures in Plato's Atlantis story. If this is true, then that would mean that when Plato said the event happened 9,000 years before Solon's time, he actually meant 900 years ago. And when he said that Atlantis to Egypt was 2,500 miles, he actually meant 250 miles. Piecing these two together, that would put the destruction of Atlantis at 1500 BC, which is close to 1450 BC, when the Thera eruption is speculated to have happened. It would also put the location of Atlantis outside the Atlantic Ocean and closer to Crete. So, have we found Atlantis yet? Well, not so fast. There are still a couple more theories to explore. So, we've all heard the wild theories about the Bermuda Triangle and how it sucks planes off the sky. Hopefully you know by now that that's not true. In fact, a new theory has arisen to displace that, which is the claim that the Bermuda Triangle houses the ruins of the city of Atlantis. In 2011, a marine engineer, Pauline Zalitsky, and her husband, Paul Weinsvig, were playing with a video robot around the boundary of the Bermuda Triangle, at depths of about 750 meters. While doing that, they stumbled on what looked to be enormous granite structures or megaliths. But more intriguingly, these structures also featured fossils of organic creatures that typically live above sea level and not at the bottom of the ocean, proving that the surface sank about 700 meters deep at one point in time. But that was not all Zalitsky and her husband found. In the marine engineer's own words, the area had been seismically active for thousands of years, and what we find on the ocean bottom are fractures from which the magma and volcanic ash came out. From these structures, we were able to delineate a configuration of the land that sank because you can see them clearly. The land that sank is very obvious from our image of the ocean bottom, and you can see bays, like harbors, and it's all at the depths of 900 and 700 meters. More evidence from further research also pointed to the fact that the city Zalitsky found actually sank after it was inundated by rising waters, which correlates with the story of Atlantis. And according to some researchers, the flood that sank this lost city in the Bermuda Triangle was caused by a crustal shift that happened about 12,900 years ago. Now, here's where it gets weird. Some reports claim that the lost city in the Bermuda Triangle was actually discovered decades before Zalitsky stumbled on it, during the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 60s to be precise. However, according to the report, America didn't want the site to fall into Russian hands, so they shut it down immediately. Of course, there's no way to confirm that that's true. However, people who hold on to the Bermuda Triangle theory also claim that the crystals which powered Atlantis while it existed are still at the bottom of the Bermuda Triangle today, and that the energy released by these crystals are powerful enough to crash whole planes and sink whole ships, which probably explains all the catastrophes associated with the Bermuda Triangle. I know this all sounds like hogwash, and that's exactly how it seemed at first, until a certain scientist named Dr. Meyer Verlog discovered the Crystal Pyramid in 2012, which she said was 3 times bigger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Suddenly, the Bermuda theory didn't seem so far-fetched anymore. But is this the location of Atlantis? Let's consider one more theory first. In 1958, a book titled The Earth's Shifting Crust, which denied the now accepted theory of continental drift, was published by a certain Charles Hapgood. This book concerns us for 2 reasons. First, the book included a foreword by Albert Einstein, which gives Hapgood serious credibility. Secondly, the book provides most of the material that substantiates the theory that we're about to talk about, which is the Antarctica theory. So, according to Professor Charles Hapgood, who was trained at Harvard, the Earth shifts her crust every 20,000 to 30,000 years. Based on this, therefore, Hapgood believed that 12,000 years ago, the northern part of Antarctica was habitable by humans and not covered in ice like it is now. This makes the existence of the Atlanteans on the continent until the time of the last ice age possible, at least in theory. But is there any hard evidence? Well, as it turns out, there is. And to find it, we have to go to the Pierre Rees world map. The Pierre Rees map was actually quite accurate, especially for its time, which was the 16th century. For context, the Pierre Rees map contained drawings of Antarctica's northern ridge at a time when Antarctica hadn't even been discovered and wouldn't be discovered for another 300 years. And this is insane when you consider that in 1513, when the map was drawn, we didn't have satellite technology just yet. Plus, for the cartographers to have drawn the Antarctic ridge, they'd have had access to the continent thousands of years before it became frozen. But we know that that's impossible. So how do we explain this? Hapgood says that Antarctica very likely was home to an ancient civilization thousands of years ago. But then, the continent was hit with some natural disaster that turned it into the land of ice that it is today, and then all of its citizens either fled or perished. But if that's true, are there any city ruins lying underneath the ice in Antarctica? Well, Einstein certainly believed that it was an idea worth pursuing, and even tried to get President Eisenhower to fund an expedition into Antarctica. That didn't work though, because Eisenhower left office before he could do anything about Einstein's proposal. But then, in 1995, Graham Hancock released a study which he titled Fingerprints of the Gods. In the study, Hancock claimed that an advanced civilization had been buried underneath Antarctica after a crustal displacement that happened in 10,450 BC. Hancock also claimed that the descendants of this civilization were responsible for the Aztec, Mayan, and Egyptian empires. When you compare this to the ancient lore of the Native Americans, who trace their ancestry to a white island in the south called Aztlan that was destroyed by a natural disaster, it kinda tracks, right? It's Hancock's idea that the crustal displacement of 10,450 BC shifted Antarctica from its former position, which was much further away from the South Pole, to its current position. This theory is very similar to Hapgood's theory, and though it appears far-fetched, in 2012, with the use of satellite imaging, a structure looking like concentric circles about 400 feet wide was spotted underneath Antarctica. To be honest, these are just the conservative theories about the location and existence of the lost city of Atlantis. Atlantean theories are so many that it would be virtually impossible to cover them all in one video. But now that we've looked at the major ones, which of them reveals the actual location of Atlantis? Well, going back to the National Geographic documentary I brought up in the beginning, Freund's discovery definitely seems convincing. Except the Spanish site he declares to be Atlantis doesn't exactly match Plato's description on several counts. Sure, Freund's lost city is circular in shape and was probably destroyed by a tsunami, but that's where the resemblance ends. The size, the concentric rings, and the dating of the site do not match what Plato described at all. This takes us to Donnelly's theory. For the longest time, Donnelly's theory was solid proof of the existence of Atlantis, until scientific methods advanced and several holes were poked into his argument. First off, as plate tectonics now show, it is geologically impossible for a large land surface to have sunk where Plato placed Atlantis. And Donnelly's prediction that Atlantis will soon be unearthed might never come true, at least not in the Atlantic Ocean. The Bermuda Triangle theory is even less credible, if nothing for the crystal pyramid that has never been discovered. In fact, the idea of Atlantis being powered by crystals came from one Edgay Case, who claimed to be able to access people's past lives by going into a trance. Plus, as it turns out, the doctor to whom the discovery of the crystal pyramid in the Bermuda Triangle was credited does not even exist. Which leaves us with the Minoan civilization theory and the Antarctica theory. Let's take Mino's first, and to be honest, even this theory, as highly credible as it seems, holds up as well as Donnelly's theory, that is to say, not very well. Besides some superficial matches, there's a whole lot else that doesn't match. From the location, to the domain of both islands, to their military, and even the timeline, on these major points, Crete and Atlantis do not match at all. Okay, so we're left with the Antarctica theory. Unfortunately, that road leads nowhere as well, since most scientists agree that Antarctica has been covered in ice for millions of years now, meaning that humans could not possibly have lived there at any point in time. Even the Pierre Rees map, which holders of this theory play as a trump card, is more speculation than proven fact. These continuous dead ends that have followed every effort to discover Atlantis have made many people come to the less interesting conclusion that Atlantis never existed. Most Atlantean skeptics today are of the opinion that Plato merely used the story as a sort of parable to explain the dangers of hubris and imperialism to any nation. And some of the biggest evidence for that includes the fact that the lost city of Atlantis has not been found in the Atlantic Ocean, where Plato claimed it existed. The lost city hasn't even been found anywhere else either, at least not right now. Instead, every attempt at finding Atlantis so far has ended with the finders either ignoring, adding to, or misinterpreting details of Plato's story, which makes these findings speculations at best. To be fair, the ocean bottom is still largely a mystery to humans, and there's lots left to discover in the water's depths. But even at that, you have to admit that the chances that modern-day oceanographers and archaeologists with sophisticated equipment like deep-sea probes would miss an entire island the size of Libya and Asia combined. So that's it? Atlantis doesn't exist then? Well, don't give up just yet, believer. There is a temple in Egypt called the Edfu Temple. On the walls of the temple, written in glyphs, is a story of an island of the gods that was once great and prosperous before tragedy struck and the island was swallowed up by the sea. According to this theory, the story was transcribed from an ancient text that had been written on animal skin. And, in fact, it is said that some sections of the original text have been lost, which means that the story on the walls of the Edfu Temple is not complete. So, could it be that many of the details in Plato's Atlantean lore were merely attempts to fill in the gaps of the original Egyptian story? Because that might totally explain this other theory that even skeptics are finding difficult to debunk. I'm talking about the Richat structure, or Eye of the Sahara. All of the theories we've looked at so far seem to fall short in one regard or the other. But when it comes to the Eye of the Sahara, the match between this structure and Plato's description of Atlantis are too obvious to be ignored. For instance, Plato said that Atlantis was 3,000 stadia, or 550 kilometers, away from the sea. In comparison, the Eye of the Sahara is about 530 to 545 kilometers away from the Atlantic Ocean. Also, Plato mentioned that there was a mountain range to the north of Atlantis, that the landmass was larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, that there was a central island surrounded by two concentric islands, and that the walls were built with black, white, and red blocks. Every one of these details finds a perfect match in the Eye of the Sahara. So, does this mean that Atlantis has really been found now? Could this be the location of the once great ancient civilization? Let me know in the comments.